Delaware's new assembly sent 3 delegates to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. One of its delegates was Thomas McKean, a Scottish-Irish attorney who stood in favor of independence. The second delegate, George Reed, was also an attorney, but he opposed breaking from Great Britain. Caesar, who had returned to Delaware to put down a rebellion by Loyalists, regarded both men as his friends. However, he sided with McKean on the issue of independence. But if Caesar wasn't in Philadelphia in time for the vote, McKean's vote for independence would be canceled by Reed's vote against it. Delaware would remain deadlocked, and the cause of independence would be weakened. Tired and choking on dust that was making his asthma worse, Caesar rode on, his ever-present green scarf covering the open wound on his face. Caesar was a young man when he developed a cancerous sore on the left side of his face. It soon spread from the bottom of his eye to his nose, and Caesar was keenly aware of how ugly the open wound looked to others. He almost always covered his face with a green scarf, and no likeness of him was ever drawn or painted. Fellow delegate John Adams once described Caesar as the oddest-looking man in the world. He is tall, thin, and slender as a reed, pale. His face is not bigger than a large apple, yet there is a sense and fire, spirit, wit, and humor in his countenance. As the trouble between the colonies and Great Britain grew more serious, Caesar's cancer also worsened. Doctors told Caesar that the best they could do for him was to perform surgery to remove the cancerous portion of his face. Caesar wrote to his brother Thomas, saying he regarded such surgery as a dreadful undertaking. Even this radical operation offered no assurance of a cure. Some doctors advised Caesar to travel immediately to England, where better treatments might be available. Thomas and many of Caesar's friends also urged him to go to England. It wasn't easy for Caesar to accept any sort of help from the English. He deeply resented the oppression by the king, and believed that the colonies should sever ties with Great Britain. He knew he might face danger in England as well. As tensions between Britain and the colonies grew, a trip by Caesar to England might end in his imprisonment, or even in his execution as a traitor. Caesar decided to have his cancer treated in Philadelphia. The surgery left a hole in his face, exposing bone and extending from the corner of his left eye, halfway down his nose. Unfortunately, the dreadful undertaking didn't cure Caesar's cancer. As he rode through an increasingly violent thunderstorm, now on horseback, he knew his vote would make him unwelcome in England, the only place he thought he might get help for the cancer. Caesar Rodney knew he was on his way to signing his own death sentence. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Delegate John Dickinson rose to speak. A Quaker and wealthy merchant from Pennsylvania, Dickinson was another friend of Caesar Rodney's. Years earlier, Dickinson had written an anti-British pamphlet called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, condemning the Townshend Acts. But in July of 1776, he didn't think the colonists stood a chance of winning a war against Great Britain. As the head of the Pennsylvania delegation, Dickinson had been doing everything he could to prevent a vote in favor of independence. Sometime during the afternoon of July 1st, as the temperature climbed, Dickinson rose to convince the delegates at the State House that his position was the wisest one. The air hung heavy with the oppressive summer heat. John Adams, his cousin Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin, and others in favor of independence watched nervously as Dickinson argued strongly against independence, telling the delegates what they already knew. A war with England would mean fighting the Indians, too, because the British would arm the tribes and encourage them to attack. A war, Dickinson reminded them, would bring down the full force of the English Army and Navy, the strongest in the world at the time. By comparison, the colonies had no trained army, no navy, and very few weapons. Dickinson